Section 48 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat, Chapter 2. He had not gone a great distance from Ben-Adair when he came to an intricate, gloomy wood, where the trees grew so thickly and the undergrowth was such a sprout and tangle that one could scarcely pass through it. He remembered that a path had once been hacked through the wood, and he sought for this. It was a deeply scooped, hollow way, and it ran or wriggled through the entire length of the wood. Into this gloomy drain, Finn descended and made progress, but when he had penetrated deeply into the dank forest, he heard a sound of thumping and squelching footsteps, and he saw coming towards him a horrible, evil-visaged being, a wild, monstrous, yellow-skinned, big-boned giant, dressed in nothing but an ill-made, mud-plastered, drab-colored coat, which swoggled and clapped against the calves of his big, bare legs. On his stamping feet were great brogues of boots that were shaped like, but were bigger than, a boat, and each time he put a foot down it squashed and squirted a barrel full of mud from the sunken road. Finn had never seen the like of this vast person, and he stood gazing on him, lost in a stare of astonishment. The great man saluted him. "All alone, Finn," he cried. "How does it happen that not one Fenian of the Fianna is at the side of his captain?" At this inquiry, Finn got back his wits. "That is too long a story, and it's too intricate and pressing to be told. Also, I have no time to spare now." "Yet tell it now," the monstrous man insisted. Finn, thus pressed, told of the coming of Cale of the Iron, of the challenge the latter had issued, and that he, Finn, was off to Terra of the Kings to find Celt MacRonan. "I know that foreigner well," the big man commented. "Is he the champion he makes himself out to be?" Finn inquired. "He can do twice as much as he said he would do," the monster replied. "He won't outrun Celt MacRonan," Finn asserted. The big man jeered. "Say that he won't outrun a hedgehog, dear heart. This Cale will end the course by the time your Celt begins to think of starting." "Then," said Finn, "I no longer know where to turn, or how to protect the honor of Ireland." "I know how to do these things," the other man commented, with a slow nod of the head. "Well, if you do," Finn pleaded, "tell it to me, upon your honor." "I will do that," the man replied. "Do not look any further for the rusty-kneed, slow-trotting son of Ronan," he continued, "but ask me to run your race, and, by this hand, I will be the first at the post." At this, the chief began to laugh. "My good friend, you have work enough to carry the 2 tons of mud that are plastered on each of your coattails, to say nothing of your weighty boots." "By my hand," the man cried, "there is no person in Ireland but myself that can win that race. I claim a chance." Finn agreed then. "Be it so," said he. "And now, tell me your name." "I am known as the Carl of the Drab Coat." "All names are names," Finn responded, "and that also is a name." So they returned to Ben-Adair. End of Chapter 2. Section 49 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat, Chapter 3. When they came along, the host of men of Ireland gathered round the vast stranger, and there were some who hid their faces in their mantles so that they should not be seen to laugh, and there were some who rolled along the ground in merriment. and there were others who could only hold their mouths open and crook their knees and hang their arms and stare dumbfoundedly upon the stranger, as though they were utterly dazed. Cale of the Iron came also on the scene, and he examined the stranger with close and particular attention. "What in the name of the devil is this thing?" he asked of Finn. "Dear heart," said Finn, "this is the champion I've been putting against ye in the race." Cale of the Iron grew purple in the face, and he almost swallowed his tongue through wrath. "Until the end of eternity," he roared, "and until the very last moment of doom, I will not move 1 foot in a race with this greasy, big-hoofed, ill-assembled resemblance of a beggar-man." But at this the carle burst into a roar of laughter, so that the eardrums of the warriors present almost burst inside of their heads. "Be reassured, my darling, I am no beggar-man, and my quality is not more gross than the blood of the most delicate prince in this assembly. You will not evade your challenge in that way, my love, and you shall run with me, or you shall run to your ship with me behind you. What length of course do you propose, dear heart?" "I never run less than 60 miles, Cale replied sullenly. "'Tis a small run," said the carle, "but it'll do. From this place to the Hill of the Rushes, Slevlochra of Munster, is exactly 60 miles. Will that suit you?" "I don't care how it's done," Cale answered. "Then," said the carle, "we may go off to Slevlochra now, and in the morning we can start our race there to here." "Let it be done that way," said Cale. These two set out then for Munster, and as the sun was setting they reached Slevlochra and prepared to spend the night there. End of Chapter 3. Section 50 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carle of the Drab Coat. Chapter 4. "Cale, my pulse," said the carle, "we'd better build a house or a hut to pass the night in." "I'll build nothing," Cale replied, looking on the carle with great disfavor. "No, I won't build house or hut for the sake of passing one night here, for I hope never to see this place again." "I'll build a house myself," said the carle, "and the man who does not help in building can stay outside of the house." The carle stumped to a nearby wood, and he never rested until he had felled and tied together 24 couples of big timber. He thrust these under one arm, and under the other he tucked a bundle of rushes for his bed, and with that one load he rushed up a house well thatched and snug, and with the timber that remained over he made a bonfire on the floor of the house. His companion sat at a distance regarding the work with rage and aversion. "Now, Cale, my darling," said the carle, "if you're a man, help me to look for something to eat, for there is game here." "Help yourself," roared Cale, "for all that I want is not to be near you." "The tooth that does not help gets no helping," the other replied. In a short time the carle returned with a wild boar which he had run down. He cooked the beast over his bonfire and ate one half of it, leaving the other half for his breakfast. Then he lay down on the rushes, and in 2 turns he fell asleep. But Cale lay out on the side of the hill, and if he went to sleep that night, he slept fasting. It was he, however, who awakened the carle in the morning. "Get up, beggar-man, if you are going to run against me." The carle rubbed his eyes. "I never get up until I've had my fill of sleep, and there is another hour of it due to me. But if you're in a hurry, my delight, you can start running now with a blessing. I will trot on your back when I waken up." Kale began to race then, and he was glad of the start, for his antagonist made so little account of him that he did not know what to expect when the Carl would begin to run. "Yet," said Kale to himself, "with an hour's start, the beggar man will have to move his bones if he wants to catch on me." And he settled down to a good pelting race. End of Chapter 4. Section 51 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat. Chapter 5. At the end of an hour, the Carl awoke. He ate the second half of the boar, and he tied the unpicked bones in the tail of his coat. Then, with a great rattling of the boar's bones, he started. It is hard to tell how he ran or at what speed he ran, but he went forward in great two-legged jumps, and at times he moved in immense one-legged mud-spattering hops, and times again, with wide-stretched, far-flung, terrible tramping, space-destroying legs, he ran. He left the swallows behind, as if they were asleep. He caught up on a red deer, jumped over it, and left it standing. The wind was always behind him, for he outran it every time. And he caught up in jumps and bounces on Kale of the Iron, although Kale was running well, with his fists up and his head back, and his two legs flying in and out so vigorously that you could not see them because of that speedy movement. Trotting by the side of Kale, the Carl thrust a hand into the tail of his coat and pulled out a fistful of red bones. "Here, my heart, is a meaty bone," said he, "for you fasted all night, poor friend, and if you pick a bit off the bone, your stomach will get a rest." "Keep your filth, beggar man," the other replied, "for I would rather be hanged than gnaw on a bone that you have browsed." "Why don't you run, my pulse?" said the Carl earnestly. "Why don't you try to win the race?" Kale then began to move his limbs as if they were the wings of a fly, or the fins of a little fish, or as if they were the 6 legs of a terrified spider. "I am running," he gasped. "But try and run like this," the Carl admonished, and he gave a wriggling bound and a sudden outstretching and scurrying of shanks, and he disappeared from Kale's sight in one wild spatter of big boots. Despair fell on Kale of the Iron, but he had a great heart. "I will run until I burst," he shrieked, "and when I burst, may I burst to the great distance, and may I trip that beggar man up with my burstings and make him break his leg." He settled then to a determined, savage, implacable trot. He caught up on the Carl at last, for the latter had stopped to eat blackberries from the bushes on the road. And when he drew nigh, Kale began to jeer and sneer angrily at the Carl. "Who lost the tails of his coat?" he roared. "Don't ask riddles of a man that's eaten blackberries," the Carl rebuked him. "The dog without a tail, and the coat without a tail," cried Kale. "I give it up," the Carl mumbled. "It's yourself, beggar man," jeered Kale. "I am myself," the Carl gurgled through a mouthful of blackberries. "And as I am myself, how can it be myself? That's a silly riddle," he burbled. "Look at your coat, tub of grease." The Carl did so. "My faith," said he, "where are the 2 tails of my coat?" "I could smell one of them, and it wrapped round a little tree 30 miles back," said Kale. "And the other one was dishonoring a bush 10 miles behind that." "It is bad luck to be separated from the tails of your own coat," the Carl grumbled. "I'll have to go back for them. Wait here, beloved, and eat blackberries until I come back, and we'll both start fair." "Not a half a second will I wait," Kale replied, and he began to run towards Ben-Adair as a lover runs to his maiden, or as a bee flies to his hive. I haven't had half my share of blackberries either, the Carl lamented as he started to run backwards for his coattails. He ran determinedly on that backwards journey, and as the path he had traveled was beaten out as if it had been trampled by 100 bulls yoked neck to neck, he was able to find the 2 bushes and the 2 coattails. He sewed them onto his coat. Then he sprang up, and he took to a fit and a vortex and an exasperation of running for which no description may be found. The thumping of his big boots grew as continuous as the pattering of hailstones on a roof, and the wind of his passage blew trees down. The beasts that were ranging beside his path dropped dead from concussion, and the steam that snored from his nose blew birds into bits and made great lumps of cloud fall out of the sky. He again caught up on Cale, who was running with his head down and his toes up. "If you won't try to run, my treasure," said the Carl, "you'll never get your tribute." And with that he incensed and exploded himself into an eye-blinding continuous waggle and complexity of boots that left Cale behind him in a flash. "I will run until I burst," sobbed Cale, and he screwed agitation and despair into his legs until he hummed and buzzed like a bluebottle on a window. 5 miles from Benedere the Carl stopped, for he had again come among blackberries. He ate of these until he was no more than a sack of juice, and when he heard the humming and buzzing of Cale of the Iron, he mourned and lamented that he could not wait to eat his fill. He took off his coat, stuffed it full of blackberries, swung it on his shoulders, and went bounding stoutly and nimbly for Benedere. End of Chapter 5. Section 52 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat. Chapter 6. It would be hard to tell of the terror that was in Finn's breast and in the hearts of the Fianna while they attended the conclusion of that race. They discussed it unendingly, and at some moment of the day a man upbraided Finn because he had not found Celt, the son of Ronan, as had been agreed on. "There's no one who can run like Celt," one man averred. "He covers the ground," said another. "He's light as a feather, swift as a stag, lunged like a bull, legged like a wolf. He runs." These things were said to Finn, and Finn said these things to himself. With every passing minute a drop of lead thumped down into every heart, and a pang of despair stabbed up to every brain. "Go," said Finn to a hawk-eyed man. "Go to the top of this hill, and watch for the coming of the racers." And he sent lithe men with him so that they might run back in endless succession with the news. The messengers began to run through his tent at minute intervals, calling "nothing, nothing, nothing," as they paused and darted away. And the words "nothing, nothing, nothing" began to drowse into the brains of every person present. "And what can we hope from that Carl?" a champion demanded savagely. "Nothing," cried a messenger who stood and sped. "A clump," cried a champion. "A hog," said another. "A flat-footed, little-winded, big-bellied, lazy-boned pork." "Did you think, Finn, that a whale could swim on land? Or what did you imagine that lump could do?" "Nothing," cried a messenger, and was sped as he spoke. Rage began to gnaw in Finn's soul, and a red haze danced and flickered before his eyes. His hands began to twitch, and a desire crept over him to seize on champions by the neck, and to shake and worry and rage among them, like a wild dog raging among sheep. He looked on one, and yet he seemed to look on all at once. "Be silent," he growled. "Let each man be as silent as a dead man." As he sat forward, seeing all, seeing none, with his mouth drooping open, and such a wildness and bristle lowering from that great glum brow that the champion shivered as though already in the chill of death, and were silent. He rose and stalked to the tent door. "Where to, O Finn?" said a champion humbly. "To the hilltop," said Finn, and he stalked on. They followed him, whispering among themselves, keeping their eyes on the ground as they climbed. End of Chapter 6. Section 53 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carle of the Drab Coat. Chapter 7. "What do you see?" Finn demanded of the watcher. "Nothing," that man replied. "Look again," said Finn. The eagle-eyed man lifted a face, thin and sharp as though it had been carven on the wind, and he stared forward with an immobile intentness. "What do you see?" said Finn. "Nothing," the man replied. "I'll look myself," said Finn, and his great brow bent forward and gloomed afar. The watcher stood beside, staring with his tense face, an unwinking, lidless eye. "What can you see, O Finn?" said the watcher. "I can see nothing," said Finn, and he projected again his grim, gaunt forehead, for it seemed as if the watcher stared with his whole face, aye, and with his hands. But Finn brooded weightedly on distance with his puckered and crannied brow. They looked again. "What can you see?" said Finn. "I see nothing," said the watcher. "I do not know if I see or if I surmise, but something moves," said Finn. "There is a trample," he said. The watcher became then an eye, a rigidity, an intense outthrusting and ransacking of thin-spun distance. At last, he spoke. "There's a dust," he said. And at that the champions gazed also, straining hungrily afar until their eyes became filled with a blue darkness, and they could no longer see even things that were close to them. "Aye," cried Conan triumphantly, "I see a dust." "And I," said another. "And I." "I see a man," said the eagle-eyed watcher. And again they stared, until their straining eyes grew dim with tears and winks, and they saw trees that stood up and sat down and fields that wobbled and spun round and round in a giddily swirling world. "There is a man," Conan roared. "A man there is," cried another. "And he's carrying a man on his back," said the watcher. "It is Cale the Iron carrying the Carle on his back," he groaned. "The great pork," a man gritted. "The no good," sobbed another. "The lean-hearted, thick-thighed, ramshackle, muddle-headed hog," screamed a champion, and he beat his fists angrily against a tree. But the eagle-eyed watcher watched until his eyes narrowed and became pinpoints, and he ceased to be a man and became an optic. "Wait," he breathed. "Wait until I screw into 1 other inch of sight." And they waited, looking no longer on that scarcely perceptible speck in the distance, but straining upon the eye of the watcher as though they would penetrate it and look through it. "It is the Carle," he said, "carrying something on his back. And behind him, again, there is dust." "Are you sure?" said Finn in a voice that rumbled and vibrated like thunder. "It is the Carle," said the watcher, "and the dust behind him is Cale the Iron trying to catch him up." Then the Fianna gave a roar of exultation, and each man seized his neighbor and kissed him on both cheeks. And they gripped hands about Finn, and they danced round and round in a great circle, roaring with laughter and relief, in the ecstasy which only comes where grisly fear has been, and whence that bony jowl has taken itself away. End of Chapter 7. Section 54 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carle of the Drab Coat, Chapter 8. The Carle of the Drab Coat came bumping and stumping and clumping into the camp, and was surrounded by a multitude that adored him and hailed him with tears. "Meal!" he bawled. "Meal for the love of the stars!" And he bawled meal, meal, until he bawled everybody into silence. Finn addressed him. "What for the meal? dear heart. For the inside of my mouth, said the carle, for the recesses and crannies and deep down profundities of my stomach, meal, meal, he lamented. Meal was brought. The carle put his coat on the ground, opened it carefully, and revealed a store of blackberries, squashed, crushed, mangled, democratic, ill-looking. "The meal," he groaned, "the meal!" It was given to him. "What of the race, my pulse?" said Finn. "Wait, wait," said the carle. I die for meal and blackberries." Into the center of the mess of blackberries he discharged a barrel of meal, and bemixed the two up and through, and round and down, until the pile of white-black, red-brown slibber-slobber reached up to his shoulders. Then he commenced to paw and impel and project and cram the mixture into his mouth, and between each mouthful he sighed a contented sigh, and during every mouthful he gurgled an oozy gurgle. But while Finn and the Fianna stared like lost minds upon the carle, there came a sound of buzzing, as if a hornet or a queen of the wasps or a savage, steeped-winged griffin was hovering about them. And looking away they saw Cale of the Iron charging on them with a monstrous extension and scurry of his legs. He had a sword in his hand, and there was nothing in his face but redness and ferocity. Fear fell like night around the Fianna, and they stood with slack knees and hanging hands waiting for death. But the carle lifted a pawful of his oozy slop and discharged this at Cale with such a smash that the man's head spun off his shoulders and hopped along the ground. The carle then picked up the head and threw it at the body with such aim and force that the neck part of the head jammed into the neck part of the body and stuck there, as good a head as ever, you would have said, but that it bad got twisted the wrong way round. The carle then lashed his opponent hand and foot. "Now, dear heart, do you still claim tribute and lordship of Ireland?" said he. "Let me go home," groaned Cale. "I want to go home." "Swear by the sun and moon, if I let you go home, that you will send to Finn yearly and every year the rent of the land of Thessaly." "I swear that," said Cale, "and I would swear anything to get home." The carle lifted him then and put him sitting into his ship. Then he raised his big boot and gave the boat a kick that drove it 7 leagues out into the sea. And that was how the adventure of Cale of the Iron finished. "Who are you, sir?" said Finn to the carle. But before answering, the carle's shape changed into one of splendor and delight. "I am ruler of the Shai of Rathcroghan," he said. Then Finn MacCool made a feast and a banquet for the jovial god, and with that the tale is ended of the king of Thessaly's son and the carle of the drab coat. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Clay Beecham. End of the carle of the drab coat.
Section 55 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Enchanted Cave of Kesh Coran. Chapter 1. Fionn mac Uil was the most prudent chief of an army in the world, but he was not always prudent on his own account. Discipline sometimes irked him, and he would then take any opportunity that presented for an adventure. For he was not only a soldier, he was a poet also. That is, a man of science, and whatever was strange or unusual had an irresistible attraction for him. Such a soldier was he that single-handed he could take the Fianna out of any hole they got into, but such an inveterate poet was he that all the Fianna together could scarcely retrieve him from the abysses into which he tumbled. It took him to keep the Fianna safe, but it took all the Fianna to keep their captain out of danger. They did not complain of this, for they loved every hair on Fionn's head more than they loved their wives and children, and that was reasonable, for there was never in the world a person more worthy of love than Fionn was. Gol Mac Morna did not admit so much in words, but he admitted it in all his actions. For although he never lost an opportunity of killing a member of Fionn's family, there was a deadly feud between Clan Bashkenna and Clan Morna. Yet a call from Fionn brought Gol raging to his assistance like a lion that rages tenderly by his mate. Not even a call was necessary, for Gol felt in his heart when Fionn was threatened, and he would leave Fionn's own brother only half killed to fly where his arm was wanted. He was never thanked, of course, for although Fionn loved Gol, he did not like him, and that was how Gol felt towards Fionn. Fionn, with Conan the Swearer and the dogs Bran and Skjolin, was sitting on the hunting mound at the top of Kesh Koran. Below and around on every side the Fianna were beating the coverts in Legny and Breffni, ranging the fastness of Glendallen, creeping in the nut and beech forests of Carberry, spying among the woods of Kyle Connor, and ranging the wide plain of Moy Connell. The great captain was happy. His eyes were resting on the sights he liked best: the sunlight of a clear day, the waving trees, the pure sky, and the lovely movement of the earth. And his ears were filled with delectable sounds: the baying of eager hounds, the clear calling of young men, the shrill whistling that came from every side, and each sound of which told a definite thing about the hunt. There was also the plunge and scurry of the deer, the yapping of badgers, and the whir of birds driven into reluctant flight. End of Chapter 1. Section 56 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Enchanted Cave of Kesh Koran. Chapter 2. Now the king of the Sidhe of Kesh Koran, Conaran, son of Imidel, was also watching the hunt. But Fionn did not see him, for we cannot see the people of Faerie until we enter their realm, and Fionn was not thinking of Faerie at that moment. Conaran did not like Fionn, and, seeing that the great champion was alone, save for Conan and the two hounds Bran and Skjolin, he thought the time had come to get Fionn into his power. We do not know what Fionn had done to Conaran, but it must have been bad enough, for the king of the Sidhe of Kesh Koran was filled with joy at the sight of Fionn thus close to him, thus unprotected, thus unsuspicious. This Conaran had 4 daughters. He was fond of them and proud of them, but if one were to search the Sidhes of Ireland or the land of Ireland, the equal of these 4 would not be found for ugliness and bad humor and twisted temperaments. Their hair was as black as ink and as tough as wire. It stuck up and poked out and hung down about their heads in bushes and spikes and tangles. Their eyes were bleary and red. Their mouths were black and twisted, and in each of these mouths there was a hedge of curved yellow fangs. They had long, scraggy necks that could turn all the way round like the neck of a hen. Their arms were long and skinny and muscular, and at the end of each finger they had a spiked nail that was as hard as horn and as sharp as briar. Their bodies were covered with a bristle of hair and fur and fluff, so that they looked like dogs in some parts, and like cats in others. And in other parts again, they looked like chickens. They had mustaches poking under their noses and woolly wads growing out of their ears, so that when you looked at them for the first time, you never wanted to look at them again. And if you had to look at them a second time, you were likely to die of the sight. They were called Cavog, Quillen, and Iran. The 4th daughter, Iarnach, was not present at that moment, so nothing need be said of her yet. Conaran called these 3 to him. "Fionn is alone," he said. "Fionn is alone, my treasures." said Kavog, and her jaw crunched upward and stuck outward, as was usual with her when she was satisfied. When the chance comes, take it, Conoran continued, and he smiled, a black, beetle-browed, unbenevolent smile. It's a good word, quoth Quillen. And she swung her jaw loose and made it waggle up and down, for that was the way she smiled. And here is the chance, her father added. The chance is here, Iran echoed, with a smile that was very like her sister's, only that it was worse, and the wen that grew on her nose joggled to and fro and did not get its balance again for a long time. Then they smiled, a smile that was agreeable to their own eyes, but which would have been a deadly thing for anybody else to see. But Fionn cannot see us, Kavog objected, and her brow set downwards, and her chin set upwards, and her mouth squeezed sidewards, so that her face looked like a badly disappointed nut. And we are worth seeing, Quillen continued, and the disappointment that was set in her sister's face got carved and twisted into hers, but it was worse in her case. That is true, said Iaran, in a voice of lamentation, and her face took on a gnarl and a writhe and a solidity of ugly woe that beat the other two and made even her father marvel. He cannot see us now, Conoran replied, but he will in a minute. Won't Fionn be glad when he sees us? Said the three sisters. Then they joined hands and danced joyfully around their father, and they sang a song, the first line of which is, Fionn thinks he is safe, but who knows when the sky will fall. Lots of people in the Sidhe learned that song by heart, and they applied it to every kind of circumstance. End of Chapter 2. Section 57 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Cave of Kesh Koran. Chapter 3. By his arts, Conoran changed the sight of Fionn's eyes, and he did the same for Conan. In a few minutes, Fionn stood up from his place on the mound. Everything was about him as before, and he did not know that he had gone into Fairy. He walked for a minute up and down the hillock. Then, as by chance, he stepped down the sloping end of the mound and stood with his mouth open, staring. He cried out, Come down here, Conan, my darling. Conan stepped down. Am I dreaming? Fionn demanded, and he reached out his finger before him. If you are dreaming, said Conan, I'm dreaming too. They weren't here a minute ago, he stammered. Fionn looked up at the sky and found that it was still there. He stared to one side and saw the trees of Kyle Connor waving in the distance. He bent his ear to the wind and heard the shouting of hunters, the yapping of dogs, and the clear whistles which told how the hunt was going. Well, said Fionn to himself. By my hand, quoth Conan to his own soul, and the two men stared into the hillside as though what they were looking at was too wonderful to be looked away from. Who are they? Said Fionn. What are they? Conan gasped and stared again. For there was a great hole like a doorway in the side of the mound, and in that doorway the daughters of Conoran sat spinning. They had 3 crooked sticks of holly set up before the cave, and they were reeling yarn off these, but it was enchantment they were weaving. One could not call them handsome, said Conan. One could, replied Fionn, but it would not be true. I cannot see them properly, Fionn complained. They are hiding behind the holly. I would be content if I could not see them at all, his companion grumbled. But the chief insisted. I want to make sure that it is whiskers they are wearing. Let them wear whiskers or not wear them, Conan counseled, "but let us have nothing to do with them." "One must not be frightened of anything," Fionn said. "I am not frightened," Conan explained. "I only want to keep my good opinion of women, and if the three yonder are women, then I feel sure I shall begin to dislike females from this minute out." "Come on, my love," said Fionn, "for I must find out if these whiskers are true." He strode resolutely into the cave. He pushed the branches of holly aside and marched up to Conaran's daughters, with Conan behind him. End of Chapter 3. Section 58 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Cave of Keshkoran. Chapter 4. The instant they passed the holly, a strange weakness came over the heroes. Their fists seemed to grow as heavy as lead, and went dingle-dangle at the end of their arms. Their legs became as light as straws, and began to bend in and out. Their necks became too delicate to hold anything up, so that their heads wibbled and wobbled from side to side. "What's wrong at all?" said Conan as he tumbled to the ground. "Everything is," Fionn replied as he tumbled beside him. The three sisters then tied the heroes with every kind of loop and twist and knot that could be thought of. "Those are whiskers," said Fionn. "Alas," said Conan. "What a place you must hunt whiskers in," he mumbled savagely. "Who wants whiskers?" he groaned. But Fionn was thinking of other things. "If there was a way of warning the Fianna not to come here," Fionn murmured. "There is no way, my darling," said Kevog, and she smiled a smile that would have killed Fionn, only that he shut his eyes in time. After a moment, he murmured again, "Conan, my dear love, give the warning whistle, so that the Fianna will keep out of this place." A little woof, like the sound that would be made by a baby and it asleep, came from Conan. "Fionn," he said, "there isn't a whistle in me. We are done for," said he. "You are indeed," said Quillen, and she smiled, a hairy and twisty and fangy smile that almost finished Conan. By that time, some of the Fianna had returned to the mound to see why Bran and Skjolin were barking so outrageously. They saw the cave and went into it, but no sooner had they passed the holly branches than their strength went from them, and they were seized and bound by the vicious hags. Little by little, all the members of the Fianna returned to the hill, and each of them was drawn into the cave, and each was bound by the sisters. Oisin and Oscar and Maclugach came, and the nobles of Clan Bashkenna, and with those of Clan Carcaran and Clan Schmal, they all came, and they were all bound. It was a wonderful sight, and a great deed, this binding of the Fianna, and the three sisters laughed with a joy that was terrible to hear and almost death to see. As the men were captured, they were carried by the hags into dark, mysterious holes and black, perplexing labyrinths. "Here is another one," cried Kevog as she bundled a trust champion along. "This one is fat," said Quillen, and she rolled a bulky Fenian along like a wheel. "Here," said Iran, "is a love of a man. One could eat this kind of man," she murmured, and she licked a lip that had whiskers growing inside as well as out. And the corded champion whimpered in her arms, for he did not know but eating might indeed be his fate, and he would have preferred to be coffined anywhere in the world rather than to be coffined inside that face. So far for them. End of Chapter 4. Section 59 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Tale of Keshkoran. Chapter 5. Within the cave, There was silence, except for the voices of the hags and the scarcely audible moaning of the Fianna Finn. But without there was a dreadful uproar, for as each man returned from the chase, his dogs came with him, and although the men went into the cave, the dogs did not. They were too wise. They stood outside, filled with savagery and terror, for they could scent their masters and their masters' danger, and perhaps they could get from the cave smells till then unknown and full of alarm. From the troop of dogs there arose a bang and a barking, a snarling and a howling and a growling, a yelping and squealing and bawling for which no words can be found. Now and again a dog nosed among 1,000 smells and scented his master. The ruff of his neck stood up like a hog's bristles, and a netty ridge prickled along his spine. Then with red eyes and bared fangs, with a hoarse, deep snort and growl, he rushed at the cave, and then he halted and sneaked back again, with all his ruffles smoothed, his tail between his legs. His eyes screwed sideways in miserable apology and alarm, and a long, thin whine of woe dribbling out of his nose. The three sisters took their wide-channeled, hard-tempered swords in their hands and prepared to slay the Fianna Finn. But before doing so, they gave one more look from the door of the cave to see if there might be a straggler of the Fianna, who was escaping death by straggling. And they saw one coming towards them, with Bran and Skjolin leaping beside him, while all the other dogs began to burst their throats with barks, and split their noses with snorts, and wag their tails off at the sight of the tall, valiant, white-toothed champion, Gall Mor Mac Morna. "We will kill that one first," said Kevog. "There is only one of him," said Quillen. "And each of us 3 is the match for 100, said Eoran. The uncanny, misbehaved, and outrageous Harridans advanced then to meet the son of Morna. And when he saw these 3, Gall whipped the sword from his thigh, swung his buckler round, and got to them in 10 great leaps. Silence fell on the world during that conflict. The wind went down, the clouds stood still, the old hill itself held its breath. The warriors within ceased to be men and became each an ear, and the dogs sat in a vast circle around the combatants, with their heads all to one side, their noses poked forward, their mouths half open, and their tails forgotten. Now and again a dog whined in a whisper and snapped a little snap on the air, but except for that, there was no sound nor movement. It was a long fight. It was a hard and tricky fight, and Gall won it by bravery and strategy and great good luck. For with one shrewd slice of his blade he carved 2 of these mighty termagants into equal halves, so that there were noses and whiskers to his right, and knees and toes to his left. And that stroke was known afterwards as one of the 3 great sword strokes of Ireland. The third hag, however, had managed to get behind Gall, and she leapt onto his back with the bound of a panther, and hung there with the skillful, many-legged, tight-twisted clutching of a spider. But the great champion gave a twist of his hips and a swing of his shoulders that whirled her around him like a sack. He got her on the ground and tied her hands with the strap of a shield. He was going to give her the last blow when she appealed to his honor and bravery. "I put my life under your protection," she said, "and if you let me go free, I will lift the enchantment from the Fianna Finn, and will give them all back to you again." "I agree to that," said Gall, and he untied her straps. The Harridan did as she had promised, and in a short time Fionn and Oysen and Oscar and Conan were released, and after that all the Fianna were released. End of Chapter 5. Section 60 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Tale of Kesh Coran. Chapter 6. As each man came out of the cave, he gave a jump and a shout. The courage of the world went into him, and he felt that he could fight 20. But while they were talking over the adventure and explaining how it had happened, a vast figure strode over the side of the hill and descended among them. It was Conaran's fourth daughter. If the other three had been terrible to look on, this one was more terrible than the other three together. She was clad in iron plate, and she had a wicked sword by her side and a knobby club in her hand. She halted by the bodies of her sisters, and bitter tears streamed into her beard. "Alas, my sweet ones," she said, "I am too late." And then she stared fiercely at Fionn. "I demand combat!" she roared. "It is your right," said Fionn. He turned to his son. "Oisin, my heart, kill me this honorable hag." But for the first time in his life, Oisin shrank from a combat. "I cannot do it," he said. "I feel too weak." Fionn was astounded. "Oscar," he said, "will you kill me this great hag?" Oscar stammered miserably. "I would not be able to," he said. Conan also refused, and so did Celt Mac Ronan and Mac Lugach, for there was no man there but was terrified by the sight of the mighty and valiant Herodin. Fionn rose to his feet. "I will take this combat myself," he said sternly, and he swung his buckler forward and stretched his right hand to the sword. But at that terrible sight, Gol Maymorna blushed deeply and leaped from the ground. "No, no," he cried. "No, my soul, Fionn. This would not be a proper combat for you. I take this fight." "You have done your share, Gol," said the captain. "I should finish the fight I began," Gol continued, "for it was I who killed the two sisters of this valiant hag, and it is against me the feud lies." "That will do for me," said the horrible daughter of Conaran. "I will kill Gol Mac Morna first, and after that I will kill Fionn, and after that I will kill every Fenian of the Fianna Finn." "You may begin, Gol," said Fionn, "and I give you my blessing." Gol then strode forward to the fight, and the hag moved against him with equal alacrity. In a moment, the heavens rang to the clash of swords on bucklers. It was hard to withstand the terrific blows of that mighty female, for her sword played with the quickness of lightning, and smote like the heavy crashing of a storm. But into that din and encirclement Gol pressed and ventured, steady as a rock in winter, agile as a creature of the sea, and when one of the combatants retreated, it was the hag that gave backwards. As her foot moved, a great shout of joy rose from the Fianna. A snarl went over the huge face of the monster, and she leapt forward again, but she met Gol's point in the road. It went through her, and in another moment Gol took her head from her shoulders and swung it on high before Fionn. As the Fianna turned homewards, Fionn spoke to his great champion and enemy. "Gol," he said, "I have a daughter, a lovely girl, a blossom of the dawn," said Gol. "Would she please you as your wife?" the chief demanded. "She would please me," said Gol. "She is your wife," said Fionn. But that did not prevent Gol from killing Fionn's brother Caerl later on, nor did it prevent Fionn from killing Gol later on again, And that last did not prevent Gaul from rescuing Fionn out of hell when the Fianna Finn were sent there under a new god. Nor is there any reason to complain or be astonished at these things, for it is a mutual world we live in, a give-and-take world, and there is no great harm in it. End of Chapter 6. End of The Cave of Keshkoran.
Section 61 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, Becuma of the White Skin. Chapter 1. There are more worlds than one, and in many ways they are unlike each other. But joy and sorrow, or in other words, good and evil, are not absent in their degree from any of the worlds, for wherever there is life, there is action, and action is but the expression of one or other of these qualities. After this earth, there is the world of the She. Beyond it again lies the many-colored land. Next comes the land of wonder, and after that the land of promise awaits us. You will cross clay to get into the She. You will cross water to attain the many-colored land. Fire must be passed ere the land of wonder is attained, but we do not know what will be crossed for the fourth world. This adventure of Conn the Hundred Fighter and his son Art was by the way of water, and therefore he was more advanced in magic than Finn was, all of whose adventures were by the path of clay and into fairy only. But Conn was the High King, and so the Arch-Magician of Ireland. A council had been called in the many-colored land to discuss the case of a lady named Becuma Kneaskell, that is, Becuma of the White Skin, the daughter of Owen Inver. It seems, then, that there is marriage in the other two spheres. In the She, matrimony is recorded as being parallel in every respect with earth marriage, and the desire which urges to it seems to be as violent and inconstant as it is with us. But in the many-colored land, marriage is but a contemplation of beauty, a brooding and meditation, wherein all grosser desire is unknown and children are born to sinless parents. In the She, the crime of Becuma would have been lightly considered, and would have received none or but a nominal punishment. But in the second world, a horrid gravity attaches to such a lapse, and the retribution meted is implacable and grim. It may be dissolution by fire, and that can note a destruction too final for the mind to contemplate. Or it may be banishment from that sphere to a lower and worse one. This was the fate of Becuma of the White Skin. One may wonder how, having attained to that sphere, she could have carried with her so strong a memory of the earth. It is certain that she was not a fit person to exist in the many-colored land, and it is to be feared that she was organized too grossly even for life in the She. She was an earth woman, and she was banished to the earth. Word was sent to the She's of Ireland that this lady should not be permitted to enter any of them, from which it would seem that the ordinances of the She come from the higher world, and it might follow that the conduct of earth lies in the She. In that way, the gates of her own world and the innumerable doors of fairy being closed against her, Becuma was forced to appear in the world of men. It is pleasant, however, notwithstanding her terrible crime and her woeful punishment, to think how courageous she was. When she was told her sentence, nay, her doom, she made no outcry, nor did she waste any time in sorrow. She went home and put on her nicest clothes. She wore a red satin smock, and over this a cloak of green silk, out of which long fringes of gold swung and sparkled, and she had light sandals of white bronze on her thin, shapely feet. She had long, soft hair that was yellow as gold, and soft as the curling foam of the sea. Her eyes were wide and clear as water, and were gray as a dove's breast. Her teeth were white as snow, and of an evenness to marvel at. Her lips were thin and beautifully curved, red lips in truth, red as winter berries and tempting as the fruits of summer. The people who superintended her departure said mournfully that when she was gone there would be no more beauty left in their world. She stepped into a coracle. It was pushed on the enchanted waters, and it went forward, world within world, until land appeared, and her boat swung in low tide against a rock. So far for her. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Joan Windle, Hampshire, Illinois. Section 62 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Becuma of the White Skin, Chapter 2. Conn the 100 Fighter, Ardrí of Ireland, was in the lowest spirits that can be imagined, for his wife was dead. He had been Ardrí for 9 years, and during his term the corn used to be reaped 3 times in each year, and there was full and plenty of everything. There are few kings who can boast of more kingly results than he can, but there was sore trouble in store for him. He had been married to Enya, the daughter of Brishlin Bin, king of Norway, and next to his subjects, he loved his wife more than all that was lovable in the world. But the term of man and woman, of king or queen, is set in the stars, and there is no escaping doom for anyone. So when her time came, Enya died. Now there were 3 great burying places in Ireland, the Bruch of the Boyne in Ulster, over which Angus Og is chief and god, the She-Mound of Cruachan-Ahi, where Achel Anbual presides over the underworld of Connacht, and Tailtin in Royal Meath. It was in this last, the sacred place of his own lordship, that Conn laid his wife to rest. Her funeral games were played during 9 days. Her keen was sung by poets and harpers, and a cairn 10 acres wide was heaved over her clay. Then the keening ceased, and the games drew to an end. The princes of the 5 provinces returned by horse or by chariot to their own places. The concourse of mourners melted away, and there was nothing left by the great cairn but the sun that dozed upon it in the daytime, the heavy clouds that brooded on it in the night, and the desolate, memoried king. For the dead queen had been so lovely that Conn could not forget her. She had been so kind at every moment that he could not but miss her at every moment. But it was in the council chamber and the judgment hall that he most pondered her memory, for she had also been wise, and lacking her guidance, all grave affairs seemed graver, shadowing each day and going with him to the pillow at night. The trouble of the king becomes the trouble of the subject, for how shall we live if judgment is withheld, or if faulty decisions are promulgated? Therefore, with the sorrow of the king, all Ireland was in grief, and it was the wish of every person that he should marry again. Such an idea, however, did not occur to him, for he could not conceive how any woman should fill the place his queen had vacated. He grew more and more despondent, and less fitted to cope with affairs of state, and one day he instructed his son Art to take the rule during his absence, and he set out for Ben Adair. For a great wish had come upon him to walk beside the sea, to listen to the roll and boom of long gray breakers, to gaze on an unfruitful, desolate wilderness of waters, and to forget in those sights all that he could forget, and if he could not forget, then to remember all that he should remember. He was thus gazing and brooding, when one day he observed a coracle drawing to the shore. A young girl stepped from it, and walked to him among black boulders and patches of yellow sand. End of Chapter 2. Section 63 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Becuma of the White Skin, Chapter 3. Being a king, he had authority to ask questions. Conn asked her, therefore, all the questions that he could think of, for it is not every day that a lady drives from the sea, and she wearing a golden-fringed coat of green silk, through which a red satin smock peeped at the openings. She replied to his questions, but she did not tell him all the truth, for indeed she could not afford to. She knew who he was, for she retained some of the powers proper to the world she had left, and as he looked on her soft yellow hair and on her thin red lips, Conn recognized, as all men do, that one who is lovely must also be good, and so he did not frame any inquiry on that count, for everything is forgotten in the presence of a pretty woman, and a magician can be bewitched also. She told Khan that the fame of his son Art had reached even the many-colored land, and that she had fallen in love with the boy. This did not seem unreasonable to one who had himself ventured much in fairy, and who had known so many of the people of that world leave their own land for the love of a mortal. "What is your name, my sweet lady?" said the king. "I am called Delvecam, Fair Shape, and I am the daughter of Morgan," she replied. "I have heard much of Morgan," said the king. "He is a very great magician." During this conversation, Khan had been regarding her with the minute freedom which is right only in a king. At what precise instant he forgot his dead consort we do not know, but it is certain that at this moment his mind was no longer burdened with that dear and lovely memory. His voice was melancholy when he spoke again. "You love my son?" "Who could avoid loving him?" she murmured. When a woman speaks to a man about the love she feels for another man, she is not liked, and, he continued, when she speaks to a man who has no wife of his own about her love for another man, then she is disliked. "I would not be disliked by you," Bekuma murmured. "Nevertheless," said he regally, "I will not come between a woman and her choice." "I did not know you lacked a wife," said Bekuma, but indeed she did. "You know it now," the king replied sternly. "What shall I do?" she inquired. "Am I to wed you or your son?" "You must choose," Khan answered. "If you allow me to choose, it means that you do not want me very badly," said she with a smile. "Then I will not allow you to choose," cried the king, "and it is with myself you shall marry." He took her hand in his and kissed it. "Lovely is this pale, thin hand, lovely is the slender foot that I see in a small bronze shoe," said the king. After a suitable time, she continued, "I should not like your son to be at Tara when I am there, or for a year afterwards, for I do not wish to meet him until I have forgotten him and have come to know you well." "I do not wish to banish my son," the king protested. "It would not really be a banishment," she said. "A prince's duty could beset him, and in such an absence he would improve his knowledge both of Ireland and of men. Further," she continued with downcast eyes, "when you remember the reason that brought me here, you will see that his presence would be an embarrassment to us both, and my presence would be unpleasant to him if he remembers his mother." "Nevertheless," said Khan stubbornly, "I do not wish to banish my son. It is awkward and unnecessary." "For a year only," she pleaded. "It is yet," he continued thoughtfully, "a reasonable reason that you give, and I will do what you ask. But by my hand and word, I don't like doing it." They set out then briskly and joyfully on the homeward journey, and in due time they reached Tara of the Kings. End of Chapter 3. Section 64 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Bekuma of the White Skin. Chapter 4. It is part of the education of a prince to be a good chess player, and to continually exercise his mind in view of the judgments that he will be called upon to give, and the knotty, tortuous, and the perplexing matters which will obscure the issues which he must judge. Art, the son of Khan, was sitting at chess with Cramdis, his father's magician. "Be very careful about the move you are going to make," said Cramdis. "Can I be careful?" Art inquired. "Is the move that you are thinking of in my power?" "It is not," the other admitted. "Then I need not be more careful than usual," Art replied, and he made his move. "It is a move of banishment," said Cramdis. "As I will not banish myself, I suppose my father will do it, but I do not know why he should." "Your father will not banish you." "Who then?" "Your mother." "My mother is dead." "You have a new one," said the magician. "Here is news," said Art. "I think I shall not love my new mother." "You will yet love her better than she loves you," said Cramdes, meaning thereby that they would hate each other. While they spoke, the king and Bekuma entered the palace. "I had better go to greet my father," said the young man. "You had better wait until he sends for you," his companion advised, and they returned to their game. In due time, a messenger came from the king directing Art to leave Tara instantly and to leave Ireland for 1 full year. He left Tara that night, and for the space of a year he was not seen again in Ireland. But during that period, things did not go well with the king, nor with Ireland. Every year before that time, 3 crops of corn used to be lifted off the land. But during Art's absence, there was no corn in Ireland, and there was no milk. The whole land went hungry. Lean people were in every house, lean cattle in every field. The bushes did not swing out their timely berries or seasonable nuts. The bees went abroad as busily as ever, but each night they returned languidly with empty pouches, and there was no honey in their hives when the honey season came. People began to look at each other questioningly, meaningly, and dark remarks passed between them, for they knew that a bad harvest means somehow a bad king. And although this belief can be combated, it is too firmly rooted in wisdom to be dismissed. The poets and magicians met to consider why this disaster should have befallen the country, and by their arts they discovered the truth about the king's wife, and that she was Bekuma of the white skin, and they discovered also the cause of her banishment from the many-colored land that is beyond the sea, which is beyond even the grave. They told the truth to the king, but he could not bear to be parted from that slender-handed, gold-haired, thin-lipped, blithe enchantress, and he required them to discover some means whereby he might retain his wife and his crown. There was a way, and the magicians told him of it. If the son of a sinless couple can be found, and if his blood be mixed with the soil of Tara, the blight and ruin will depart from Ireland, said the magicians. If there is such a boy, I will find him, cried the 100 fighter. At the end of a year, Art returned to Tara. His father delivered to him the scepter of Ireland, and he set out on a journey to find the son of a sinless couple, such as he had been told of. End of Chapter 4. Section 65 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Bekuma of the White Skin. Chapter 5. The High King did not know exactly where he should look for such a savior, but he was well educated and knew how to look for whatever was lacking. This knowledge will be useful to those upon whom a similar duty should ever devolve. He went to Ben Adair. He stepped into a coracle and pushed out to the deep, and he permitted the coracle to go as the winds and waves directed it. In such a way he voyaged among the small islands of the sea until he lost all knowledge of his course and was adrift far out in the ocean. He was under the guidance of the stars and the great luminaries. He saw black seals that stared and barked and dived dancingly, with the round turn of a bow and the forward onset of an arrow. Great whales came heaving from the green-hued void, blowing a wave of the sea high into the air from their noses and smacking their wide, flat tails thunderously on the water. Porpoises went snorting past in bands and clans. Small fish came sliding and flickering, and all the outlandish creatures of the deep rose by his bobbing craft and swirled and sped away. Wild storms howled by him, so that the boat climbed painfully to the sky on a mile-high wave, balanced for a tense moment on its level top, and sped down the glassy side as a stone goes furiously from a sling. Or, again, caught in the chop of a broken sea, it stayed shuddering and backing, while above his head there was only a low, sad sky, and around him the lap and wash of gray waves that were never the same and were never different. After long staring on the hungry nothingness of air and water, he would stare on the skin-stretched fabric of his boat as on a strangeness, Or he would examine his hands and the texture of his skin and the stiff black hairs that grew behind his knuckles and sprouted around his ring, and he found in these, after long staring on the hungry nothingness of air and water, he would stare on the skin-stretched fabric of his boat as on a strangeness. Or he would examine his hands and the texture of his skin and the stiff black hairs that grew behind his knuckles and sprouted around his ring, and he found in these things newness and wonder. Then, when days of storm had passed, the low gray cloud shivered and cracked in 1,000 places. Each grim islet went scudding to the horizon as though terrified by some great breadth. And when they had passed, he stared into vast after vast of blue infinity, in the depths of which his eyes stayed and could not pierce, and wherefrom they could scarcely be withdrawn. A sun beamed thence that filled the air with sparkle and the sea with 1,000 lights. And looking on these, he was reminded of his home at Tara, of the columns of white and yellow bronze that blazed out sunnily on the sun, and the red and white and yellow painted roofs that beamed at and astonished the eye. Sailing thus, lost in a succession of days and nights, of winds and calms, he came at last to an island. His back was turned to it, and long before he saw it, he smelled it and wondered, for he had been sitting as in a daze, musing on a change that had seemed to come in his changeless world, and for a long time he could not tell what that was which made a difference on the salt-whipped wind, or why he should be excited. For suddenly he had become excited, and his heart leaped in violent expectation. "It is an October smell," he said. "It is apples that I smell." He turned then and saw the island, fragrant with apple trees, sweet with wells of wine, and, hearkening towards the shore, his ears, dulled yet with the unending rhythms of the sea, distinguished and were filled with song, for the isle was, as it were, a nest of birds, and they sang joyously, sweetly, triumphantly. He landed on that lovely island, and went forward under the darting birds, under the apple boughs, skirting fragrant lakes, about which were woods of the sacred hazel, and into which the nuts of knowledge fell and swam. And he blessed the gods of his people, because of the ground that did not shiver, and because of the deeply rooted trees that could not gad or budge. End of chapter 5.